Crystal Empire Part 1 begins with some random guard pony telling Celestia, "It has returned." Now granted, I don't know what they were discussing earlier, but "it" is obviously a super vague and uninformative pronoun. If Celestia knew about the dangers of a returning Sombra, why not research a bit more, or at least tell Twilight about it? Sure, they don't know much, and it's not like they were there 1,000 years ago. Oh wait. Anyway, Celestia quickly tells her guards to go find Shining Armor, and presumably Cadence as well. Which means that upon Shining Armor and Cadence's arrival, Sombra had already been there for a good while. Which means that they had some sort of battle preventing Sombra from inhabiting the grounds of the Crystal Empire. Boy, I would like to see that. Celestia apparently mentions nothing about the Empire, or that Twilight would have to take a trip, or anything remotely catastrophic in the letter, so Twilight is left to her own devices about what this test means. It's a funny gag for the viewer, but logically speaking, there's no reason for Celestia to hold on to this information until they meet in person. In times of war, I guess, she would be afraid of her letter getting intercepted, and I frankly don't know a lot about the Mahoney mailing system, but it seems to be near instantaneous if Celestia's writing a letter instead of going herself. But I'm always impressed by how well the episodes start off, and this is particular in story arc-driven episodes like this one. The beautiful animation captures the six in a rather revealing light, their facial expressions cluing in the audience about their personalities and their visual presentation filling in the rest. Twilight obviously gets the most attention being the main character, but even this is done well. We get a lot of subtle hints to episodes that have happened before in this quick interchange between Twilight, Spike, and Applejack. And this is valuable because not everybody has been following episode by episode, of course, and being a season premiere, this could have drawn in a lot of new viewers. Twilight being so frantic about a test tells us about her obsessive-compulsive behavior when it comes to academia. And the reaction Applejack has of this being her handling it quite well seems to note a previous episode where she had a complete breakdown for not having a letter a week. If that wasn't enough to clue you in, when Spike says, "Calm down, it's just a test," I took that as a huge callback to Lesson 0. However, in spite of this, I feel that Spike should be familiar enough with Twilight to know that his comment would merit that kind of reaction. In any case, we fast forward to Twilight entering the throne room. A small side note, we can clearly see Celestia grabbing Twilight's books, but in the next scene, they're nowhere to be found. They're completely gone. Anyway, Luna's skepticism is well deserved since she was able to see firsthand how terrible Sombra was. Celestia then goes into exposition about how Sombra was a bad guy and how they defeated him and all that. There are some interesting things that Celestia says, particularly the repercussions of the line, "If the Empire is filled with hope and love, those things are reflected across all of Equestria." Now this can easily mean the Aurora that we see coming from the Empire at the end of Part 2, however her tone of voice and seriousness does not suggest this. If Celestia was truly not referring to a quick light show, then the ramifications of Twilight failing are much greater than I had originally thought in my first viewing. It would mean that the Crystal Empire's magic, probably conducted through the use or misuse of the Crystal Heart, is capable of influencing the emotional states of all ponies across Equestria. This would put the Crystal Heart up there with the elements of harmony on the big bad weapons that could serve to protect Equestria, or destroy it. If this is the case, the gravity of what Celestia has asked Twilight to do is clearly something that should invoke Celestia's personal action, as this task has far more repercussions than if even Chrysalis has succeeded in conquering Canterlot. Let me reiterate the gravity of the Crystal Heart. Should Twilight fail, it would probably plunge all of Equestria into an age of darkness, not by virtue of Sombra conquering the lands as Discord had done, but by magic. All ponies would be magically enchanted to feel fear and hatred, something I view as more fearful than any threat seen in equestrian history, as much of their magic draws strength from the emotional state or feelings of its user. Now the opposite can be true. If Twilight succeeded, then are all the ponies of Equestria magically enchanted to feel love and hope? Anyway, what really surprised me in this scene was when Celestia was shown using black magic. She said something about hatred and fear taking hold, which may induce this type of magic, and this could also be the trigger for Twilight to know how to use it in Part 2, but that's getting ahead of myself. If Celestia, and by extension Twilight, is able to use this magic, then I think it follows that both Celestia and Twilight are susceptible to this type of corruption, because fear and hatred do live in their hearts, at least to some extent. This is interesting because if we view Celestia as a stand-in for the Judeo-Christian God, then God having hatred or fear is simultaneously extremely interesting and religiously nonsensical. A more appropriate resolution to this quandary would be to say that this reinforces her as some sort of stand-in for a goddess more suited to the Greco-Roman pantheon. Celestia mentions something about moving to the next level of her studies, foreshadowing Twilight's ascension. So we know that Mystery Cure was planned way back here, or maybe even before this season. So there's that continuity plus. Also, Luna's disapproving face is adorable. I can understand where Celestia comes from in saying that it must be Twilight and Twilight alone to help Cadence and Shining Armor protect the Empire. For if this wasn't the case, the whole thing would be just a review of the Friendship of Magic as the 2 prior seasons have done. And while that would be completely fine as a season opener, the writers opted not to do that. When she said those lines on my first viewing, I was pretty much convinced that this season was going to be Twilight-centric or have a Twilight arc at the end of the season because of this. This is an ingenious part of training on Celestia's part. Twilight would have to see this as a test, and thus have no qualms about doing this solo without the elements of harmony backing her up. Oh, and I should also mention that this is the only supervillain that Twilight has defeated without the help of the elements of harmony. Now, all she has to do is resolve a major botch in the universe, or fate, or destiny, or whatever without the help of some magical artifact. Song time! Failure Song wasn't the most notable song, but some of the background gags are pretty funny. When Twilight pours the tea for the 2 background ponies, they're just left sitting there baffled for a moment, and I think Spike actually makes for a fair ballerina. Pinky's first appearance is full of fun as usual. The viewer gets to see her logic-defying abilities and party cannon firsthand on her introduction, as all of the streamers and confetti fly impossibly back down into the cannon, and this facial expression is pretty funny to see. There's some immaculate animation going on in these couple scenes with the snow and Twilight's hair in the earlier musical number. Season 3 is where the staff really steps it up in terms of animation quality and what they bring to the children's cartoon table, at least in my opinion. The second song is more catchy and a lot more enjoyable than Failure Song. Ballad of the Crystal Pony is more uplifting and the melody reminds me of Winter Wrap-Up. The feel is similar since Twilight is seemingly managing every pony and we don't really see her doing anything productive apart from telling everybody what to do. The main 6 all do what they're meant to do, except Rarity. She's apparently colorblind in this episode. Rarity, that's all of 2 colors. On a side note, Pinky has found a musical instrument that she can't play well, and Twilight is terrible at sculpture, and I can't believe that Cadence didn't notice that the crystal heart is emblazoned on her cutie mark. Also, if somebody felt strongly enough to rip out a page from the Crystal Empire's history, why not just burn the library? Or at least the book? Seems sloppy, Sombra. I don't quite remember where I read this, but I'm fairly sure that the inspiration behind Sombra's character was that of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. This would fall in line with my earlier theory describing how truly powerful the Crystal Heart is. And it seems fitting that Celestia implies that should Twilight fail,
cover all the lands of a second darkness.
Cadence's raw magical power is also quite impressive. I'd like to note that Shining Armor and Cadence were sent as soon as the guard arrived, maybe taking a day or so to get there. Then they had to have battled Sombra, enact the spell, and wait patiently for Twilight to finish her musical number to take the train there. She had kept the spell going all throughout the preparation for the Crystal Fair, so I believe that she should have had the spell going for a few days at the least, upwards to a week or a week and a half at most. This speaks quite a lot about the sheer amount of fortitude she must have to sustain a giant bubble for so long. Shining Armor did something similar in A Cannonball Wedding, although I think this to be an easier job, as something was not actively trying to get in all the time. And I believe that he didn't have to sustain it for as long as of a duration. Another curious thing is that Twilight never brought the elements of harmony. Maybe this was because of the requirements for her test, but it seems unwise to leave such a powerful weapon behind when the fate of Equestria hangs in the balance. The magic of the Crystal Empire is fueled by emotion. And even without the conduit of the Crystal Heart, I would think that because of this, magic and emotion are fundamentally tied together, at least in the Crystal Empire, quite possibly all of Equestria. And this brings up a couple of questions. If emotions are what powers magic and decides its nature, what would ever happen if an Alicorn, the paragon of pony magic, ever lost her way? We saw an example of this with Princess Luna and Nightmare Moon, but was that the product of her magic going haywire, or the influence of the Nightmare entity? What would happen if Celestia gave in to her rage and decided to destroy Discord? Would we see a rippling effect of rage across all ponies? We know that ponies are connected by magic, and we see the Crystal Empire ponies collectively powering the heart and regaining the magic in their coats together. And the collective amnesia adds to this theory, so would Celestia falling from grace seriously affect the ponies in Ponyville? Did Luna falling have a similar effect? Could Celestia have fallen once in the past, and could these emotions have taken a physical form as Discord? It's a lot of questions, but I'm getting ahead of myself. If you have any theories explaining or denying these questions, please respond in the comments below. I could just be talking out of my flank. All in all, it was a pretty successful front of a two-parter. The introduction and rising action are noticeably more boring than the climax and falling action in most stories, so this is fairly acceptable. Looking back on it though, I can safely say that this had more build-up and characterization, even in the 22-minute runtime, than a lot of AA or AAA movies that come from Hollywood, not that that's saying much. Upon my first viewing, it did a good job keeping my attention and building suspense for the second part. Thanks for watching!